say we're just getting the logistics figured out here, but maybe a quick poll in the chat. Where are folks calling from today? Any any North America, the Americas? We're calling in from San Francisco today. Anyone in California? Looks like, oh, LAX. We got LAX. Nice. I love that airport. And I love LA. As you see, we do have the Q&A feature. Feel free to use that if you have any questions as we go. Just get some of the other logistics out of the way. I think that should be the main one though. But yeah, we'll leave some room for questions towards the end. And if you drop stuff in the Q&A, Jay can prompt us kind of as we go based on what's relevant that comes up. So don't hesitate to ask. We should have plenty of time to cover some stuff there. As we go. Get some of the other logistics out of the way. And let's say we'll get started here in 2 minutes. Good to see folks in the Zoom. Got Adar, Bill, Daniel, Emily. Welcome, everyone. Jeff, Jesse, Kyle, Michael. Welcome, folks. Welcome. Reynaldo, welcome. Thank you for taking your lunch, or maybe this is your afternoon, but choosing to spend it with us. It's going to be a good time. One more minute and we're going to get started here. Welcome, Theo Harris. Thank you for joining us. All right, and it looks like we're live everywhere else, Esplin, so we can kick this off. Yeah? Cool. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about observability in the Next.js ecosystem. We're going to be covering a little bit more about our SDK at Highlight, other SDKs like the Vercel OpenTelemetry one, what the different standards are, and hopefully paint a pretty clear picture of how to get started with observing your Next.js application. You can go to the next slide, please. And just logistically, as any questions come up, feel free to use the Q&A. We also have questions that could come in on Twitter or on YouTube, and we'll try to do our best to follow up with those as they come up. But just to introduce myself, my name is Vadim. I'm the CTO and run engineering at Highlight. Really excited to be talking about some of this today. With me, I have Jay, our CEO, head of product. Hello, Jay. And we have Chris Esplin, who runs our developer relations and is the mastermind behind a lot of these webinars. Thanks for joining us today as well. In terms of what we're going to be covering, we'll be covering at a high level what is observability in Next.js and why does Next.js make monitoring web applications trickier than certain other frameworks. And with that, we're going to compare some of the options you have for observing your Next.js stack. We're going to talk about our own SDKs, And we're going to compare that with the Vercel OpenTelemetry SDK, the at Vercel OTel package, specifically what do the different tools do differently. Then we're going to do a deep dive on that at Vercel OTel package, showing you guys how to get started with it in the Highlight context. So using Highlight as the backing store for all that data that Vercel OTel can send us. We'll also cover a little bit about log drains and other Vercel specific quirks regarding how to monitor your production Vercel deploy. And with that, we're going to close out on the metrics piece, which is a recent beta tool that we've launched, part of our product that allows you to look at all this data over time. So time series visualization of all of the Vercel data that you're going to be collecting. With that, I'll hand it over to myself. So a little bit about observability. It's good to understand what we're talking about here first. Observability has to do with capturing errors and understanding performance problems across your system. Typically, an application has a lot of different moving parts. You can have your primary front end. That's how your users are interacting with the site. That front end is going to be hitting some sort of API middleware layer. Maybe that layer is just responsible for authentication and identifying the user. That typically is going to be hitting other microservices where you're going to be making requests to maybe some other Teams service, some other external dependency, etc. So with all of that, there's a lot of moving parts, and oftentimes it's hard to get to the root cause of where did a problem actually start from, or if there's some sort of latency in your API, where is it actually coming from? In Next.js, it can be particularly tricky because there's different runtimes, such as the serverless runtime. There's also the edge runtime, which has a limited capability compared to the normal Node.js runtime. There's also different kinds of rendering. Sorry, actually, we have a little bit more on that previous slide, Chris. So if we can hop by. There's a little bit more with different runtimes running in different kinds of execution environments, such as server-side rendering, ISR, SSR, SSG. There's different kinds of places that code is running, and it can be particularly tricky to tie all that together. So some of the common tools that you might be familiar with, like Prometheus, that's a metrics tool, Winston, Pinot, those are logging tools. Sometimes they don't necessarily work across different parts of the Next.js ecosystem, but those are some other common tools that people use in Node.js. And OpenTelemetry is one that we're going to be digging deeper into on this call to as kind of a pretty modern open source one solution across different languages and frameworks. So OpenTelemetry is a specification for capturing errors, recording spans for identifying performance, and collecting logs as well across every sort of ecosystem you can think of. So across Node.js, Next.js, but across other languages as well, even PHP, Java, .NET, everything. So with that, get to the next slide. With Next.js specifically, one of the things that we mentioned is how it's difficult to capture some of that data. And I'll hand it over to Chris to cover that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, okay. So we've done a lot of work to get our Highlight SDKs to work and play well with Vercel. And these are the two big issues we ran into. First, the Edge runtime in Vercel does not support Node.js SDKs. So anything that relies on Node.js packages is not going to work in Edge. So we have to sort of work in this very trimmed down environment, and a lot of the typical dependencies we use, like OpenTelemetry JS, are just not going to work. Second, serverless runtimes shut down quickly. OTel is actually not built around that. OTel is built for an always-on Node.js server for OTel.js. So it assumes it's always on, so it just will flush in the background. The problem is Vercel is so aggressive about shutting down these Edge and Node.js lambdas that it'll just shut it down before OTel can flush, and you'll randomly be missing chunks of data. So we had to do a bunch of work on our SDKs to kind of keep Vercel alive just long enough to flush. Okay, let's pass this back to Vadim.
Oh. Yeah, sorry, I was muted there. But yeah, there's a number of different solutions for the Next.js ecosystem, and we're going to be focusing on our Highlight SDK specifically built for Next.js and the easiest way to get started with observing your Next.js stack. And also talking about the @Vercel OTel one. Both of those use the OpenTelemetry specification. The OpenTelemetry specification has a couple of different implementations, some officially supported by the OpenTelemetry open source community, some by other individual contributors. And those have to do with different Node.js runtimes and SDKs. So the primary OpenTelemetry node works in Node.js environments, but it doesn't work in the Edge runtime because the Edge runtime for Vercel is specific to the Cloudflare runtime. And if you use Cloudflare workers in other contexts, you'll understand this too, where you don't have the same access to all of the functions that Node.js exposes. So there's a couple of different implementations for OpenTelemetry for the Edge runtime. Specifically, there's one that's built by the OpenTelemetry community called OpenTelemetry WebJS, which is actually part of their standard for browser support as well. But without getting in the weeds there too much, to cover the differences between the Highlight SDK and the @Vercel OTel one, the Highlight @highlight-run/next package will be able to capture your logs and your traces from the server side, and will also be opinionated about setting up the logs and traces to associate to the session replays on the Next.js front end. So with the SDK, you get everything in one box where you'll get the server-side instrumentation. You'll also get the browser instrumentation for session replay and front-end log recording as well. We do swap out different SDKs under the hood. So we use OpenTelemetry Node for our Node.js runtime. In the Edge runtime, we use a Cloudflare compatible implementation of the OpenTelemetry spec. And we, as Esplin mentioned, we have a couple of smart monkey patches and clever tricks that we do in order to flush data as we need to be compatible with a production Vercel deploy. Now, the problem is that we make a few assumptions and we assume that, for example, you are interested in the session replay in Next, and you also set up X highlight request header parsing, stuff like that, that is a little bit specific to the Highlight ecosystem, though we're working on improving that to make our SDK a little bit more agnostic as well. And with @Vercel OTel, this relatively new package, you only get logs and traces, but it's very well optimized for Vercel. So if you are a Next.js Vercel only production deploy, it's going to work really well across different kinds of runtimes. So across Edge, across Node, in SSR, etc. It's going to, just like our SDK, takes advantage of the Next.js built-in OpenTelemetry span emission, but is just really good at flushing that data across those different runtimes. But again, it is specific to Next.js, so you won't be able to use @Vercel OTel in just a Node.js application, or let's say in some other app. So with that, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the Highlight implementation, and I'll hand it over to Chris to do some of that.
All right, real quick, can we stop and just ask if does anyone have any questions? Have we inspired anyone to ask any questions yet? If not, we can get moving. Okay. All right, so I'm going to keep going. Some of this is a little bit repetitive. So this is our Highlight run/next SDK that we've been working on and continuing to maintain. And it captures Node.js and Edge routes using this custom Cloudflare OTel adapter that Vadim mentioned. It also captures logs, traces, and errors, which is more than you'll get from just Vercel OTel. Because it also fixes the problem where it patches OTel to wait for the flush. So let's go. So let's talk about Vercel OTel. So Vercel OTel is a new SDK from Vercel, pretty recent, in the last month or two. And we may eventually integrate it into Highlights SDKs. It seems to be stable and seems to be the way to go. It can send data to Highlights collector, but the setup has to be appropriate. And so we've gone through the motions of figuring that out. And that's what we're going to show you right now, is how you can do this yourself with Vercel OTel, not using Highlights SDKs. Okay. So we're going to do these 3 steps. First, we're going to install the Highlight SDK so we can get a web client and secure session ID working. That's not necessary for Vercel OTel to work, but it's really nice and it makes our demo look a whole lot better. Also, we need to send our data to Highlight anyway so we can see it. So it's good for us to do this. Next, we're going to configure Vercel OTel in Next.js. There's no client for just raw Vercel OTel, and it can't, without that front end, it would not have sessions. And finally, we will validate our installation on app.highlight.io.
Chris, before we move to the next slide, I had a quick question for the audience. I'm curious if anyone can guess why we are interested in using the secure session ID and what does it have to do with the backend instrumentation. Do we have any guesses from the audience? Don't worry about being wrong here or not being sure. Just would love a poll here about why we're using that. So we'll give it 30 seconds. And you never know, maybe there's a prize to the best answer. So a lot of reasons to get engaged here. Oh, looks like we have for security. Okay. Any other answers? For security, because clients can inspect HTTP requests and see the cookies going around. Okay. A little bit more elaborate. I like it. So you're kind of hitting on the reason that we use a cookie, which is to be able to connect the front end to the back end. But we actually pass the session ID from our browser instrumentation so that when we start recording the replay of a user on the browser side, we want to be able to attach that to what's going on server side. So all the logs and traces for a particular API request, we want them to be attributed back to a session replay that came from our browser instrumentation. And this is actually pretty specific to Next.js. Next.js doesn't make it possible for us to send that data over later on because the API request can happen at the beginning of rendering the HTML. So it's actually one of the first things to happen. So we need to be able to have a cookie that remembers that from the previous load of the page or navigation so that the session will continue to be associated with data from the server side. But so security wise, yeah, it's not necessarily security, but we do use cookies as a way to pass that data around. And again, that's how we associate the server side logs and traces across the SDKs with our browser session replay.
Nice.
Thanks, Daniel, for participating. And thank you, anonymous listener, as well. Back to you, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Vadim. Okay. So first we install our dependencies. You can see all this on our github.com/highlight/vercel-otel repo that we've got up. It's public. You can just go see this code if you want. It's not a whole lot of code. We're using PNPM. It's pretty much the same as NPM. So in this case, PNPM create next app, then PNPM I for install Vercel OTel, JS cookie, and highlight.run. Those are the 3 packages we're actually going to need. Okay, now we're going to install a client. This is highlight specific. Oh, sorry. Secure session ID and session secure ID are secure session ID is a misprint. It should all be session secure ID. It's confusing. I make that mistake all the time for some reason whenever I'm typing this out. Okay, so we're going to install this client. The client is highlight specific, but it generates these session IDs and it sends our sessions to highlight. Without this, we wouldn't get our session replay and we wouldn't have any sense of sessions actually. So we're going to write, and you can see this code on the right, we write a custom init highlight component to call h.init manually. And that's that first arrow. And we pass in our first argument is our project ID, and then we've got a bunch of options. Then down below on line 28, the second arrow, you can see where we set the session secure ID cookie. That cookie is what connects the front end to the back end and makes all this fun stuff possible. Okay, so next we'll install the server. It's not too hard. We enable instrumentation hook in the next.conf file. It's experimental at the moment, but I'm pretty certain it's not going to be experimental for long. They're building a lot on top of this at the moment. So we do that. Then we we create our own instrumentation.ts file at the root of our project. That's either at the root or inside of our source folder if you're using the source folder, SRC folder. And that just calls register OTel from the Vercel OTel package and exports its register function. That's all standard instrumentation.ts. You'll notice that we're just setting the project ID. Because this is not highlight specific, we have to just remember that these are the attributes that it expects to make it work and connect to us. All right. Next, we'll come over here and create another function. This is just a generic function, but we're going to use it later. We call it init highlight server. This function captures the session cookie and sets it on the active span. So this is what we'll do to capture that cookie. And then we need to inject this init highlight server somewhere in our app. It's easiest if you do it your root layout or a specific page, however you want to. This helps us get those SSR session spans all connected up to the front end client. Finally, we're going to go validate our installation. It's not too hard to do. Again, you just pm run dev, spin up the local server, hit the landing page, navigate around a little bit, and then go to app.highlight.io to review your session.
And a quick question on that instrumentation. Quick question for the audience. Did anyone remember what instrumentation hook, what that setting it to true in the next config is for? Can anyone tell us? Does anyone know what this setting is doing, instrumentation hook true?
That's a little tricky. I kind of breezed right through that.
Maybe for security? Maybe that's another answer? Or any other answers? Why is it a opt-in flag? Let's give it another 15 seconds. Any thoughts? Enabling open telemetry. That's going to be the right answer. Just to elaborate a little bit on that, setting to true makes Next look for an instrumentation.ts file. If you switch to the next page, Esplin. Next, at start of the API route, at start of rendering, will automatically, if you set that setting to true, will look for this file as an entry point into the application. So it'll automatically run this register function, the default export, I believe, or maybe it's the register export, and it will look for that function and execute it automatically at the startup of everything. And it's actually not OpenTelemetry specific because you can put anything in here. You can put a console log, you can do something else, you can set up highlight, you can set up some other SDK. Instrumentation hook is just meant to be a way to define a next entry point via an instrumentation.ts that happens before start of any sort of next specific activity. So in this case, just to reiterate, register OTel sets up the Vercel OpenTelemetry exporter that then will take all of the automatically emitted Next.js spans and all of the spans that you might have in your application and start sending them per the settings that you define in this register OTel.
All right, thank you. All right, so once we validated our installation.
One last interruption. Sorry, Espen. But we did have a question from Bill, which is, are the secure session ID and the session secure ID two different things?
We did cover that actually, and it was a typo on a previous slide.
My bad.
Cool. All right. So we can validate our installation. In this case, we're looking at traces. We went to the traces tab and highlight, and we're able to see this nice distributed trace right here. You can see that got the top level is the get from this flame chart. That's the get request that is incoming through Next. and we can trace it all the way through. And yet this is all Next's native tracing and instrumentation. We didn't have to write any of this, get it all for free, all sent straight to highlight. Now, this part is the highlight specific part. This is the client. So you can, I mean, obviously this is just a screenshot, but it's interactive and you can watch it play. You can watch the session play and you can navigate to the logs and traces for the specific session. And let's just look at the logs. This is what some logs look like. Now, to be very clear, these logs are coming from the client application because Vercel Hotel doesn't know how to send logs. That's a Highlight SDK thing that we do, but Vercel Hotel doesn't know how to do that. It is possible, we'll cover that in a minute, how to make it work, but yeah. Okay, so just, we already covered that. So let's talk about log drain real quick. So this is the important part that about the logs. Highlights SDKs patch the console.log in both the client and in the server, and then sends spans to highlight every time you use the console.log or console.info. Same for errors. It's really, really useful, really helpful. But it's not necessary to get logs out of Vercel. You can also configure our log drain, our Vercel log drain plugin or integration with Vercel to just get all the logs all the time, regardless of your OpenTelemetry setup. And to the right here, there's an example of how in our SDKs we send these spans. And you can just send a span like that to highlight and we'll interpret it as a log. So yeah, here's Vercel log drain. The big note here is if you use Highlights SDKs, you're going to get logs from our SDKs. If you also use Vercel log drain, you'll get those logs as well. You'll get double logs. So that can be a little frustrating sometimes. Doubles up your data usage. Okay, Vadim, let's hand it off to Vadim for some metrics talk.
Yeah, so we just covered all of this data that we're ingesting from the Vercel OpenTelemetry instrumentation, but we haven't really shown yet how to look at it at a high level. You might be looking at a particular route, at a particular instance of the route, trying to figure out why it was slow. But if you're trying to monitor things at a high level, Highlight just recently launched a metrics product. The metrics product allows you to create dashboards out of all of the data that Highlight is capturing for you and allows you to dig into specific instances of issues going wrong. So for example, you can have a chart here of the total number of error logs or the P90, the 90th percentile latency of a particular endpoint, or how long your SQL queries are taking. And you can visualize that as a time series here to be able to jump into specific instances when that's happening. Beyond that, in the Highlight product, you can set up alerts on this kind of data. So if you want your team to get a notification when a route is performing much slower than before, you can set something up like that as an alert, but the dashboard allows you to just monitor that at a high level. And on the next slide, we have an example of what a chart like that might look like. So here, based on that data that we were just sending from the traces, we were actually taking a look at that resolve page components Next.js span. So that's a span that gets emitted by Next.js to show how long it takes to resolve the route to a particular page component. So if you have a lot of page components or a deeply nested structure, Next.js might take a while to resolve it. And we can set up an easy query here to look at the median duration, how long it takes on average to perform that operation. And just in the bottom right corner, it's a little small here, but you can actually build your own filter to say, I'm looking for this kind of span, and then I'm looking for the P50 of this particular metric. These are all things that are going to be automatically instrumented by the next implementation. Next.js just has these spans coming out of the box. So that's really cool because it gives you a way to look at all that data that you're getting and then track it over time. Beyond that, we do allow you to query all of the data sources that are in Highlight. So you can extract user analytics data out of sessions. You can look at how many users is your site seeing per page or per type of product. You can look at traces to understand latency and errors, looking at things like HTTP status code and grouping by URL. You can visualize just high-level errors that are coming in, and look at other data as well, like metrics, which could be coming from the browser via the Web Vitals instrumentation. The filter language is shared across this and the rest of the product. So in Highlight, you can put the same syntax for the filters into the other parts. And finally, there's a lot of aggregation you can do, so you can evaluate much more complicated things than just a count, but do things like P50, the median, etc.
We've got a question here. Is tracing on the roadmap?
Yes. So it's not just on the roadmap, it's public and live. And yes, general tracing is part of our product. What we just showed you here is the ability to ingest those traces by sending them via the Vercel OTel instrumentation. So the spans that we showed you, the traces, they are built into Next.js. So they're automatically created. But you can also create your own spans, your own traces for certain functions, for SQL queries, anything that's relevant. And then you can have auto instrumentation using the OpenTelemetry libraries as well, where commonly used libraries like Postgres, Redis, or PG, et cetera, they're going to be automatically emitting spans for their respective code. So yes, it's not just on the roadmap, it's live and it's what we're talking about. And there's a lot more to come here. So we're going to be doing a lot more features that support traces, like building better dashboards that can extract all that data, allowing you to more simply set up traces, etc. And Jay just shared a link to an overview from our docs as well, if you're curious. I had a question for the audience, actually, before we jump to the takeaway. I'm curious, what's a common, maybe we can just share in the chat, what's a kind of dashboard that you look at in terms of, or have looked at in the past to monitor the health of your application?
This is a tricky one. I spent some time trying to figure out dashboards for Next.js. And
Yeah,
it
does
would take
anyone
a little
have
bit
like
of time to get right.
do you have a favorite graph, Chris?
No, I don't yet have one. I would like to get one. I need to spend more time with it.
API latency. Yeah, that's a good one. And that's exactly what we're showing here, but this is specifically for a subset of the API latency, which is resolving page components. Oh, error rates. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a classic one. So just being able to see how often are errors happening in your application. Another good one, health checks, latency error codes. So beyond just specifically errors, what if you have a specific endpoint that's like API route / health that might be checking on your database, checking on other infrastructure? You want to make sure that that's staying up and get alerted otherwise. Latency for those sorts of things. So when you reach out to different API endpoints, obviously something important. Active users, that's a good one. So more on the product analytics, being able to visualize how often users are visiting different pages and even grouping by which page is the most commonly visited. That's definitely something you can do by querying the sessions part of the product. And yes, this is being streamed to YouTube. You can check out youtube.com/@highlight-io and should be able to find it there. We can link that as well here.
I
Thanks,
actually
everyone.
think
Thanks,
the live,
Richard. Oh,
yeah, I
is it
think
not
the
being
live
streamed to
stream
YouTube?
is not on YouTube, not this time.
Okay. Oh, wow. Lots more. But we will have a recording, Richard. If you want to share this with anyone else, we're happy to send you the Zoom recording. We should have been streaming to YouTube, and
It is streaming to YouTube. It is streaming to YouTube, and yeah, you'll be able to watch it later on YouTube.
maybe it's unlisted. Oh, it's an unlisted video, so right now you can't watch it. But here, Richard. Oh, and I'm gonna put the link and throw it in the chat as well. I like Emily's question, longest contentful paint, LCP as it is also known. LCP is a common metric that is a web vital that essentially refers to how long it takes for your HTML to actually paint. And it's a good proxy for complicated DOM mutations, or if you just have a really dense CSS, for example, for a particular element, or there's a tree of elements that's really complicated and gets refreshed, then the browser can take a long time to render it. And for the end user, the impact is that the page seems unresponsive or can freeze or can take a long time to initially load and paint. So it is a helpful metric, and our browser client, so the one set up by the Next SDK, is going to be automatically capturing that as well. Another question we have here, I'm a backend engineer getting into front end, so most of the dashboards I have are backend centric. So error rates, request response times for different APIs, database cluster state is kind of what this person, Daniel, is familiar with. I use Datadog right now, but I'm interested in Highlight. For example, I have an agent monitoring the state of a extra DB cluster and looking into different metrics like node count, etc. So Daniel, this brings up a really good point that we haven't touched on here. OpenTelemetry actually extends beyond tracing and logging into backend metrics, things like CPU and database health and memory usage, those kinds of more infra level metrics that you're probably familiar with. OpenTelemetry's agent, it's called a collector. You can run it as a standalone thing alongside your database to monitor that VM or that database's different metrics, for example. And while that's part of the OpenTelemetry spec, we don't currently support ingesting metrics, but that's on our immediate roadmap. So in the next 2 quarters, we're going to be able to ingest those metrics as well. And Vercel actually emits some of those metrics as well. Right now, the metrics that we show here are specific to our trace metrics. So in traces, you can, in OpenTelemetry, there's this concept of an event, and you can attach a metric event to a trace. And that's how we visualize web vitals in the UI right now, but definitely something to look forward to soon. Cache misses, cache hits, as well as general overview of hits misses, for example. So yeah, those are kinds of metrics that you would want to report at a very granular level, but maybe not record all of them because it would be a lot of data. So the OpenTelemetry metric spec actually provides a way for the collector as well as the ingest collector to downsample that data to something much more manageable. Another question here, and Daniel, if you have any other questions, I was going to mention this soon in the call too, but we have a link inside of our dashboard, inside of Highlight. In the top right of the screenshot, you can actually see the button called Book a Call. You can schedule a one-on-one call with me and some other engineers on the team, and we'd be happy to show you some of this more in detail and talk with you as well. So please do reach out. We can share a link to that as well in the chat. Another question here is, are there other observability platforms like Datadog that we will have support? So the nice thing about the OpenTelemetry instrumentation is that it is vendor agnostic. So one thing we did mention is that once you set up that @Vercel OTel SDK, you can use Highlight as one of the endpoints that you send data to, but you can also send that data to other places, like, for example, Datadog. I actually am not 100% specific about them if they support OpenTelemetry, but there are plenty of other vendors that do support OpenTelemetry as an open source specification. So that is something that you could look into, but is a nice thing about using our SDK or the Vercel OTel SDK. Daniel asks, are the generic open source data collectors for different things? Example, MySQL query, cache hit miss, and then push that to the OpenTelemetry agent and then sends to Highlight. Then your team won't need to worry about creating custom agents like Datadog does and just focus on Highlight dashboards for custom things. And I guess I answered this, but actually to understand your question, I think, yes, the OpenTelemetry collector is generic. It actually runs, the OpenTelemetry collector is an agent. It also forwards to our collector. It has a number of different plugins, and they're called receivers. You can set up custom receivers inside of the OpenTelemetry collector. And the collector can then, can collect and process different data. So then inside of the collector, you can specify those sampling settings. You can specify where that data is going, in what formats. You can process the data to drop certain kinds of data, etc. So you can do a lot with a generic templating language that they have in YAML without having to worry about, like, is this being highlight specific? Exactly. So I think we got that answer. And Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have a OpenTelemetry overview. Is that one we've already done, or is that a webinar that we have coming up in the future?
Yeah, we did one in the past, like about a month ago, on OpenTelemetry and Next.js. So yeah, when we you can actually find that on our YouTube channel if you want to check that out. As well as we're putting out a blog post soon that kind of summarizes that. And then we have one upcoming on client side OpenTelemetry. So yeah, we are definitely talking more specific about that in the future and have in the past.
Cool. Thank you everyone for all the questions and participation. It really makes it engaging. I think we can go to the next slide here. So just to kind of close out with what we talked about, the simplest way to get started with a Next.js application is definitely the Highlight SDK. We actually did a full live stream on just our SDK last time. We can drop this link in the chat as well. What we did is go through a deep dive of how to set up the instrumentation for just our SDK in particular. And that will get you set up as quickly as possible with the entire Highlight stack. But if you're doing something more or you want to take advantage of the Vercel OTel SDK for remaining vendor agnostic, or just to do more low-level OpenTelemetry kind of work, you can definitely set up the Vercel OTel SDK as we just described. And what you're going to get is support from Vercel in terms of cross runtime availability, making sure that things continue to work in the edge runtime and use their best practices. So in short, I would definitely recommend checking out that other live stream, getting started with the Next SDK that we built, but consider playing around with the Vercel OTel example that we shared today as well. And with that, I'd like to open it up for any more questions. We had a great time with you all today. I really appreciate all the questions. Genuinely, it made it so much more engaging and a great conversation. Just want to urge everyone to check out the Next.js OpenTelemetry documentation. There's quite a bit out there, and they go a bit more in depth on the implementation for the next specific SDK and how to get started there. And we'll also share our doc in the chat here in case you want to dig deeper. Check out Highlight. Obviously, we would love to have you play around with that. And yeah, with that, I guess we wanted to share a link to more of a, if you do want to take advantage of the opportunity to talk with me and some of the other engineers on the team, we'd love to set up like a private call with anyone who's interested. You can actually do that just with the following link. And I'm happy to go over any of this stuff in more detail as like a private chat. I think we have another question. Oh, thank you guys, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel, for joining. How are you using tracing internally at Highlight? Oh, that's a really good question. So what we actually do is we set up the entire stack on our own application. So when you visit app.highlight.io, our public-facing cloud instance is running Highlight to capture all that data. On the backend, our backend is implemented Golang. So we actually get spans coming out of our backend attributed to our sessions. And time after time, we use that to debug our own issues, our own production issues using our own SDK. So that kind of dogfooding is always a really good way to validate the product, for us to continue to learn about pain points or things that we need to improve and do better. And yeah, it's just a great way to keep improving the product. Beyond that, the session replays for us have been able to really help with understanding how people use our product, figuring out when we release a new feature, how much adoption it's getting. And some of those dashboards I showed you, we have our own dashboards that we look at internally that use our own data that is a great tool for us. So that's a great question. on the Next.js documentation for getting started. I think we wanted to share that as well, and I'll just drop the quick start link. Richard asks, curious, how large is the Highlight SDK contribution to bundle size? Yeah, it's a good question. On the front end, what we do is we actually have a very minimal Bootstrap SDK, and then that Bootstrap SDK will lazy load a script that doesn't affect the rest of your app loading and the rest of your JavaScript. So in terms of getting like on the browser side where performance is really critical, it's minimal. And in terms of other impact on performance, we actually have a blog post about the underlying technology that we use for session replay called the HTML DOM mutation recorder API. We can share that blog post as well if you're curious. On the backend side, so OpenTelemetry's SDK is fairly large, but I believe with the instrumentation hook, the way that instrumentation hook actually runs, it doesn't slow down the startup of your API response in those different runtimes. So, but definitely actually something we could explore in more detail is how that's how the OpenTelemetry SDKs have an impact on the server side. Daniel asks, is there a roadmap for heat maps? We're actually really glad you asked because we do have heat maps in a private beta right now. We have the ability to look at heat maps by analyzing front end click events. So it's more like a click map and a heat map as well. So heat map, the difference there is going to give you more of the visualization of just XY coordinates where people are spending the most time hovering or click or moving around. Whereas a click map will actually track the HTML elements that were clicked and group those various clicks on the same element together. And then on a session replay, you can really visualize that to know like this is the button that everyone clicks. So those are a little bit different, but we do have both of those in private beta. So I would urge you to reach out to us if you want to try that out soon. And in terms of trying that out, I don't know, Jay, if we want to share, but I guess that call link we shared would be a great way to for us to show you that live and then set you up on your workspace. Any other questions? It can be about anything too. Not, it can be about like, what is my favorite food? So I don't know if I have an answer to that. Okay, if not, thanks all for joining. Thank you, Emily, Daniel. Quick question. Is there a webinar talk, etc., on how to integrate with Go? We don't have one for Go yet. We do have an extensive guide on our docs that will show you how to do that. And we can actually point you to our own. It's pretty funny that as an open source, fully open source application, we can just point you to our code for some of the best practices. But we do have a guide here that I'm sharing in the docs, and do check out Highlight's repo as well. So if you just check out github.com/highlight/highlight, you will see our entire repository of code as well. So yeah, that's a good inspiration for us to look at a Golang integration in the future. All right, folks. Thanks, everyone, and hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Bye.